Something was discovered during the war that was never meant to be found. It wasn't part of the original plan. It wasn't in the official reports. And the moment it was acknowledged, three things became inevitable: the discovery, the decision, and the consequences that command could no longer control. The jungle held secrets in 1942. Not the kind written in intelligence briefs or marked on situation maps. The kind that lived in the space between what men expected and what they found waiting for them in the dark. Captain Daniel Reeves stood at the edge of the marine perimeter on Guadalcanal's southern approach, watching the tree line. August heat pressed down like a physical thing, thick enough to feel in the lungs with every breath. Sweat soaked through uniforms within minutes of dawn, never drying, just accumulating layers of salt and grime. Mosquitoes formed clouds thick enough to obscure vision, their constant whine a backdrop to everything else. Behind him, Henderson Field, the airstrip they'd taken 2 weeks ago, hummed with the sound of engines being maintained, damage being repaired, supplies being rationed into smaller and smaller portions. The airfield was everything. Control it, and you controlled the skies for 200 miles in every direction. Lose it, and the entire operation collapsed. Simple mathematics that both sides understood perfectly. "They're out there," said Corporal Hayes, crouched beside a freshwater-cooled Browning that had been firing so long the barrel housing still ticked with residual heat. "You can feel it before you hear it, like pressure building before a storm." Reeves didn't answer. He'd learned in the Philippines that some observations didn't need confirmation. Hayes was 23 and had seen more combat in 6 months than most men saw in full deployments. If Hayes said something was coming, something was coming. What nobody had told them, what no briefing had prepared them for, was how quickly confidence could drain, away in the jungle. The Japanese had swept through Asia like a storm. Singapore, the fortress that couldn't fall, had fallen in a week. The Philippines, defended by American and Filipino forces, had collapsed in months. Hong Kong, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, all gone. Fortress cities falling, colonial armies dissolving under pressure. And now, for the first time, American forces stood in their path with orders to hold ground instead of retreat. The problem was simple. Nobody knew if it would work. "Captain." Sergeant Novak appeared from the communications dugout, face slick with sweat and something else. Worry, maybe. Or the beginning of understanding. Brush's patrol made contact, heavy. "They're coming back with prisoners, documents too." "How heavy?" 30 enemy dead. No American casualties." Novak paused, letting that sink in. "Sir, the prisoners are saying their whole regiment landed last night. Close to 1,000 men. And they think we're only 2,000 strong, poorly trained, scared of night fighting." Reeves felt something shift in his chest. Not fear exactly. Recognition. The Japanese were coming with the same assumptions that had carried them across the Pacific. Speed, aggression, night attacks, close combat. The warrior spirit overwhelming material advantage through sheer audacity and willingness to die. Only this time, the material advantage was on the other side. "Get division. Tell them we need the southern line reinforced. Machine gun positions every 30 yards. Interlocking fire, artillery pre-sighted on approach routes." Reeves looked back at the tree line, where shadows seemed to move even in still air. "They're going to come straight at us." "You sure?" "I'm not sure of anything except what happens when confident men meet something they don't expect." The Ilu River crossing was barely 20 yards wide at the sandbar, where fresh water met ocean tide. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Cresswell walked the defensive line at dusk, checking positions with the kind of methodical attention that separated survivors from casualties. Each machine gun nest had been dug deep into the sandy soil, sandbags reinforced with coconut logs, water cans filled for the cooling jackets that kept the Brownings operational, ammunition crates stacked within arm's reach, fields of fire measured and marked with stakes that would be visible even in darkness. The defensive line wasn't beautiful. It was functional, mathematics expressed in sandbags and interlocking fire lanes. "They teach night attacks," Cresswell told his gunners, moving from position to position. "Fast infiltration, close quarters shock, overwhelming the enemy before he can organize. They're very good at it. Probably the best in the world at it. But doctrine only works when the enemy reacts the way you expect. Don't react. Let them come into the kill zone, then don't stop firing until there's nothing left moving. Private First Class Jackson, manning a .30 caliber mount, nodded. Slowly. He was 19, from Ohio, had never fired at a human being before landing on this island. What if they break through? They won't. But if... Then we adjust. But they won't. Cresswell's voice carried absolute certainty, the kind that came from understanding mathematics. Rate of fire multiplied by fields of fire multiplied by ammunition supply. The equation didn't care about courage or training. It cared about geometry and metal. Jackson wanted to believe that. Needed to believe it. Because the alternative was thinking too hard about what was coming in the darkness. Just after midnight, the first sounds reached them. Not battle cries. Those would come later. Just movement. The rustle of men moving through undergrowth, trying for stealth and failing because there were too many of them. And the jungle amplified everything. Boots on sand. Equipment rattling despite attempts to secure it. The small sounds of hundreds of men trying to move quietly and failing. Jackson's hands tightened on the gun's grips. Beside him, his assistant gunner, Morales, fed the belt with mechanical precision, counting rounds under his breath. They'd trained together for 8 months. They knew each other's timing the way musicians knew a rhythm section. The attack came in waves. Japanese soldiers burst from the tree line, hundreds of them, voices raised in coordinated shouts meant to terrorize and disorient. They charged across the sandbar in tight formations, bayonets fixed, grenades arcing through the air in flat trajectories that caught moonlight for just an instant before detonating in sand and water. Jackson opened fire. The Browning's sustained hammering drowned out everything else. 600 rounds per minute, every fifth a tracer burning bright enough to illuminate the carnage. Tracers cut horizontal lines through darkness, drawing paths that other gunners could follow, creating a web of intersecting fire that left no gaps. Men fell in clusters. Those who made it, past the first belt of fire, ran into the second line, then the third. The positions had been arranged, so there was nowhere to take cover, nowhere the guns couldn't reach. It wasn't combat in any traditional sense. It was execution by mathematics. The Japanese kept coming. Wave after wave, reforming after each collapse, officers shouting orders that couldn't be heard over machine gun fire. Some reached the Marine positions and fought hand-to-hand until rifle butts or grenades ended it. Jackson saw one soldier make it to within 10 feet before Morales shot him with a .45 pistol, 3 rounds center mass, the man dropping without a sound. The Browning's barrel glowed dull red in darkness. Water in the cooling jacket boiled, steam hissing from relief valves. Jackson's hands burned from heat conducted through metal grips, but he didn't stop firing. Couldn't stop. Because stopping meant thinking. And thinking meant understanding what he was doing, and understanding meant breaking. So he didn't stop. By dawn, the sandbar was carpeted with bodies. Reeves walked the line at first light, stepping carefully, looking at faces. Young men, most of them. Well equipped by Pacific standards. Arisaka rifles, Type 89 grenade launchers, even a few light machine guns. But equipment didn't matter when you charged across open ground into prepared positions. Jesus Christ, Hayes whispered, staring at the scene. How many? 800, maybe more. Reeves crouched beside a dead Japanese officer, searching pockets. Found a leather-bound notebook, pages filled with neat handwriting. Get this to intelligence. Fast. The bodies would have to be dealt with. In this heat, disease would spread quickly. But first, intelligence needed to understand what had happened here. Why an entire regiment had charged into machine gun fire and died almost to a man. What they found in those captured documents changed everything. Not the tactical information. Disposition of forces, unit designations, command structure. That was expected. What wasn't expected was the tone. The absolute confidence. The repeated assertions that American forces would break easily, that one aggressive push would send them fleeing. That material superiority meant nothing against properly trained warriors who embraced death. Colonel Vandergrift read the translations in his command post, face expressionless. Around him, staff officers waited for assessment. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines mixed with the constant background noise of construction, repair, maintenance. The airfield never stopped operating. They don't know, Vandergrift said quietly. They genuinely don't understand what they're facing. Sir. They think we're the Philippines. They think we're Singapore. Vandergrift set the papers down carefully, as if they were fragile. They think this war works the way the last 18 months worked. Attack hard, attack fast, enemy breaks, move forward. They don't realize we're not breaking. Major Kellerman, the intelligence officer, cleared his throat. So what happens when they discover that? They keep attacking, because their doctrine doesn't have a backup plan. It assumes the first plan works. Vandergrift looked at the situation map, pins marking known enemy positions. They'll come again. Larger force, better coordinated, probably from the south where the jungle gives them cover. And when that fails, they'll come again, until they run out of men or supplies or both. And us? We hold. We make every attack cost them more than they can afford. We make them learn that this isn't China, this isn't Malaya. This is a different kind of war with different rules. Outside, artillery crews were already digging in howitzers on pre-selected positions. Forward observers marked coordinates on maps, calculating trajectories, planning fire missions that could be called down in minutes. Communication lines were strung from the front to fire direction centers. The entire defensive system was being woven tighter, transforming the jungle around Henderson Field into a killing ground that could be activated with a single radio call. The Americans had brought their own kind of warfare to the Pacific. Not warrior spirit or tactical brilliance. Industrial warfare. Where the answer to every problem was more metal, more coordination, more systematic application of force. And the Japanese were about to learn what that meant. September came with rain that turned the ground into soup and made every movement exhausting. Water fell in sheets, not drops, flooding foxholes faster than they could be bailed, turning trails into rivers of mud. Lieutenant Commander Edson, transferred from radar operations to defensive planning, stood on the ridge south of Henderson Field and watched his men dig in. The position dominated the approaches. Whoever held this ground controlled access to the airfield. They'll come this way, Edson said, speaking to no one in particular. Jungle's too thick for armor, too dense for effective artillery observation. Infantry approach, night attack, try to overwhelm us before we can respond. His executive officer, a captain named Reinhardt, frowned. How do we stop that? We don't stop it. We channel it. Edson pointed at the ravines flanking the ridge. They'll infiltrate through there, trying to get behind us. We let them think it's working. Then we hit them from pre-positioned machine guns and mortars that have been ranging those approaches for a week. That's cold. That's war. Edson's voice carried no emotion. They're coming to kill us, and take this airfield. We're going to make sure they die trying. The only question is how many of our people die in the process. Better planning means fewer. The raiders and paratroopers who'd been assigned to Edson's defensive line were different from regular infantry. Harder-edged, less patient with procedure, more willing to improvise. They'd been selected for offensive operations and now found themselves in static defense. But they understood the stakes. If Henderson Field fell, the entire campaign collapsed. Everything depended on holding this one ridge. They dug in deep. Machine gun positions reinforced with sandbags and logs. Mortar pits pre-sighted on likely approach routes. Coordinates written on cards that could be read by flashlight. Communication wires buried to prevent cutting. Water, ammunition, and medical supplies positioned for quick access. Every advantage of terrain and preparation maximized. Sergeant William Porter supervised his mortar crew with the precision of a craftsman. 27 years old, veteran of a dozen actions already, he knew that mortars were the infantry's private artillery. Memorize these coordinates, he told his men. When it gets dark, you won't be able to see the map. You'll need to know where to drop rounds based on sound alone. On the night of September 12th, the Japanese came. Not in waves this time. Infiltration tactics. Small groups moving through darkness, probing for weak points, trying to slip past defensive positions and attack from behind. It was sophisticated, well executed, exactly the kind of operation Japanese forces excelled at. Except Edson had planned for exactly this. Flares burst overhead at irregular intervals, illuminating the ravines and slopes in harsh white light that threw sharp shadows. Mortar rounds landed on pre-plotted coordinates, adjusted by forward observers who'd spent days memorizing terrain features. Machine guns opened fire, not in panic, but in coordination, each position covering specific sectors, interlocking fields preventing any gaps. The fighting was close and vicious. Japanese soldiers reached Marine positions and fought with grenades and bayonets. Edson himself picked up a rifle at one point, firing at shapes moving through darkness barely 10 yards away. The entire ridge became a confused melee of small unit actions, squad against squad, sometimes man against man. Porter's mortar crew worked in darkness, loading and firing by touch, adjusting aim based on shouted corrections from forward observers. The 60mm tubes coughed regularly, sending high-explosive rounds arcing into the night. Each round fell with a distinctive crump that shook the ground, throwing up dirt and shrapnel that could shred a man at 20 yards. "Drop 50! Fire for effect!" came the call from somewhere forward. Porter adjusted the bipod, dropped another round down the tube, felt the recoil kick through his shoulder. Somewhere in the darkness, men were dying from his efforts. He tried not to think about that, tried to focus on the mathematics of trajectory and distance, but the defensive structure held. What the Japanese didn't know, couldn't know, was that artillery from the 11th Marines had registered fire missions covering every approach to the ridge. When Edson called for support, the response came within minutes, high-explosive shells, impacting so close that shrapnel wounded Marine defenders. But it shattered Japanese assault formations before they could concentrate for breakthrough attempts. The 75mm howitzers fired from positions a mile behind the ridge, crews working in practiced rhythm. Load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. The guns kicked back with each shot, brass casings piling up around gun pits. Forward observers called corrections by radio, walking artillery fire across Japanese positions with methodical precision. By dawn, the attack had failed. Japanese casualties were staggering. Hundreds dead on the slopes and in the ravines. Marine casualties were heavy but sustainable. The ridge held. Edson walked the defensive line at first light, checking positions, talking to survivors. Nobody cheered. Nobody celebrated. They'd done the job and paid the price. That was all. "They'll come again tonight," Edson said quietly. "Same plan. More men. Be ready." And they did come again. The second night's assault was even more desperate. Japanese commanders, knowing they were running out of time, threw everything into breakthrough attempts. Waves of infantry supported by what little artillery they'd managed to bring forward. Concentrated attacks on single points, trying to crack the defensive line through sheer weight of numbers. It didn't work. The Marines had strengthened their positions during the day. More ammunition brought forward. Reinforcements filling gaps. Artillery pre-registered on even more coordinates. When the attack came, the response was overwhelming. Porter's mortar crew fired until the tubes were too hot to touch, until ammunition stocks ran low, until dawn broke and revealed the full extent of the carnage. More than 800 Japanese soldiers died on Edson's Ridge over those 2 nights. The position that would forever carry his name had become a monument to the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine. What happened over the next 3 months wasn't a single battle. It was attrition warfare conducted in slow motion, grinding away at both sides, but especially at the Japanese, who lacked the logistics to sustain prolonged combat. The Japanese kept attacking because their doctrine offered no alternative. The Americans kept defending because Henderson Field gave them air superiority during daylight, and air superiority meant control of supply lines, but the human cost was crushing on both sides. Private Michael Torres, a machine gunner from the 2nd Tenaru action, wrote in a letter home that was never sent, "They keep coming. Every night, every week. We keep killing them. Hundreds, thousands. It doesn't matter. They keep coming. And we're all getting sick. Malaria. Dysentery. Things we don't have names for. Half the company can't stand up without shaking. But we keep fighting because stopping means dying. So we don't stop." The letter was found in Torres's pocket after he died from infected wounds 3 weeks later. Not from enemy action, from a simple cut that turned septic in the humid heat, and there weren't enough antibiotics to treat everyone who needed them. Malaria swept through both forces like a slow plague. The mosquitoes that swarmed at dusk and dawn carried parasites that attacked red blood cells, causing fever, chills, delirium. Quinine helped if you had it. The Americans had it. The Japanese didn't, or not enough. Dysentery was worse in some ways. The constant diarrhea, the dehydration, the weakness that made simple tasks exhausting. Men lost 20, 30 pounds, became walking skeletons barely able to carry their own equipment. The Japanese situation was catastrophically worse. Captured diaries, and there were many because Japanese soldiers kept detailed records even as they starved, painted a picture of systematic collapse. Rice rations reduced to handfuls per day. Medical supplies exhausted by September. Orders to attack positions that everyone knew were suicide but had to be followed because orders were absolute and retreat was unthinkable. One entry, translated later by intelligence officers, read, "We are told the Americans are weak. We are told they cannot endure. But their guns never stop firing. Their aircraft control the sky. Their wounded are evacuated and cared for. Ours die where they fall. We bury them when we have strength. When we don't, we leave them." The truth is, we were lied to. Not about American weakness, about our own strength. The writer's name was Lieutenant Nakamura. He died during the October offensive, leading a nighttime assault that collapsed under artillery fire before reaching Marine lines. His body was found weeks later, notebook still in his pocket. October brought the largest Japanese offensive of the campaign. General Hyakutake himself came to Guadalcanal to personally command the operation. He brought elements of the 2nd Division, experienced troops from China, along with what artillery pieces had finally been delivered via destroyer runs. The plan was sophisticated. Coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main effort coming from the south through dense jungle. 9 tanks, rare on Guadalcanal because of the difficulty transporting them, would support a Western attack to draw American attention. It almost worked. On the night of October 24th, Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller's battalion held the southern defensive line when the main Japanese assault hit. Approximately 5,000 troops attacked in coordinated waves, supported by artillery fire that crashed through the jungle canopy. The fighting became legendary. Corporal Thomas Briggs manned a machine gun position that became critical to the defense. When his assistant gunner was killed by a grenade, Briggs continued firing alone, pausing only to reload and clear jams. Japanese soldiers reached his position twice. Both times he drove them back with grenades and pistol fire before returning to the Browning. "I stopped counting after the first. Belt," he said later, in a debriefing that was recorded but classified for decades. "You just keep firing. You don't think about what you're hitting. You see movement, you fire. See more movement, fire again. The gun does the work. You're just the mechanism that keeps it fed." Artillery from the 11th Marines fired danger-close missions that landed within yards of Marine positions. Forward observers called in fire so close that trees burst from the impact, showering defenders with splinters and shrapnel. But it stopped Japanese breakthrough attempts. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between Japanese forces and Henderson Field. But they didn't break. They held because breaking meant losing everything, and losing everything was unthinkable. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had collapsed. General Nasu was dead, killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers died in the attempt to break through. American casualties were several hundred killed and wounded. Severe but sustainable. The tanks that had attacked from the west were all destroyed. Anti-tank guns, artillery, even an M3 Stuart tank knocked them out in quick succession. Burning Japanese armor littered the Matanakaw River crossing. November brought naval battles that would decide the campaign's outcome. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days, saw some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. On the night of November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force in confused night fighting at point-blank range. Rear Admiral Callahan died on the bridge of the USS San Francisco when a Japanese shell penetrated the bridge structure. Around him, officers and enlisted men died at their posts, continuing to fight even as the ship burned. The Americans lost heavily. 2 cruisers and 4 destroyers sunk. But the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei, disabled in the night action and sunk by aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. 2 nights later, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment but was intercepted by USS Washington and USS South Dakota. What followed demonstrated the evolution of naval warfare. Washington's radar-directed fire control allowed accurate gunnery at ranges where Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. 9 16-inch shells slammed into Kirishima, each one weighing over a ton, each impact like a bomb detonating inside the ship's hull. Kirishima sank with heavy loss of life. Perhaps most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy exceeded 5,000 men. Most drowned when their transports were sunk. Others died on beaches under artillery fire. The few who made it inland arrived without equipment, without supplies, without hope of reinforcement. This was the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had expected reinforcement and resupply. Instead, they learned that the naval battles had failed, that the convoys were destroyed, that no more help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies that had been critically short became non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors could do nothing except watch men die. Captured Japanese diaries from this period painted a horrifying picture of conditions. Entries described rice rations reduced to 1 ball per day. Disease spreading everywhere. Bodies burned when soldiers had the strength, left to rot when they didn't. The realization that no more supplies were coming. Men eating grass, bark, anything that might provide calories. Deaths from poisonous plants. The deterioration of soldiers into desperate, starving shadows. One medical officer's diary, captured in January, contained an entry that read, "More than half our men are incapable of combat. Not from wounds, from starvation and disease. We have no medicine, we have no food, we have orders to attack. How do we attack when men cannot walk?" December brought the final reckoning. Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. They could not admit defeat publicly, but privately they recognized that continuing the operation meant the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Approximately 11,000 Japanese soldiers remained on the island, down from a peak strength of 36,000. Of those 11,000, perhaps 7,000 were fit enough to walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weakened by starvation that they could barely crawl. The evacuation, designated Operation KE, would be one of the most successful Japanese operations of the entire war. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express that had brought them, Japanese naval forces extracted 10,652 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. It was a remarkable achievement under difficult circumstances. Fast destroyers racing down the slot under cover of darkness, loading emaciated soldiers, racing back before American aircraft could catch them at dawn. Professional seamanship and careful planning pulled off what seemed impossible. But it could not disguise the magnitude of the defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal reached a peak strength of approximately 36,000 personnel. Of these, roughly 25,000 to 30,000 died. About 14,000 killed in combat. Another 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American casualties were also severe but sustainable. The Marines and Army units that fought on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. But American industry and manpower could replace these losses. New divisions were already training. Ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. By February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had evacuated. Major General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey. Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. Reeves stood on the same ridge where Edson had fought in September, looking out at the jungle that had consumed so many lives. Behind him, Henderson Field operated at full capacity, aircraft landing and departing in continuous streams. The island was secure. The campaign was over. History would record it as a victory. But Reeves had learned something in 6 months of combat that no briefing could teach. War wasn't about who fought harder or believed more deeply. It was about systems, supply systems, communication systems, coordination systems. The side with better systems won. The side without them died. The Japanese had believed in something else: spirit, courage, warrior tradition. They'd charged into machine gun fire believing will could overcome metal. They'd attacked night after night believing persistence would break defenses. They'd starved in the jungle believing reinforcements would arrive. All of it based on assumptions that had worked everywhere else. All of it failing here because the Americans had brought industrial warfare to the Pacific, and industrial warfare didn't care about spirit or courage. It cared about production capacity, supply lines, and systematic application of overwhelming force. Reeves thought about the captured diaries, the letters found on bodies. The slow realization recorded by Japanese soldiers that they'd entered a war they couldn't win with the tools they'd been given. Something had been discovered during those 6 months. Something that changed the course of the Pacific War. Not a tactical innovation or strategic breakthrough. Just a simple truth. The warrior myth was dead. Courage couldn't stop artillery. Spirit couldn't replace food. Tradition couldn't overcome industrial capacity. And once that truth was established, once both sides understood it, the rest of the war became inevitable. Not because one side fought better, but because one side had systems that functioned and the other didn't. The discovery was made in blood on Guadalcanal's ridges and river crossings. The decision was made in planning rooms where logistics determined strategy. And the consequences played out over 3 years of island-hopping campaigns where the pattern repeated: Japanese forces fighting, with diminishing resources against American forces, fighting with expanding capacity. History recorded Guadalcanal as the turning point. The first American ground victory against Japan. The end of Japanese expansion. The beginning of the long retreat. But what history couldn't capture was the moment when men on both sides realized the truth. When Japanese soldiers understood their doctrine had failed them. When American Marines learned that victory came not from superior warriors, but superior systems. That moment happened in darkness, in jungle, in the space between attacks when men had time to think about what they'd seen and what it meant. Reeves never wrote about it, never spoke of it except in fragments, years later, when asked what Guadalcanal taught him. "It taught me that war is mathematics," he said once, in an interview that was never published. "Everything else, courage, leadership, tactics, matters only within the framework mathematics creates. We won because our equation worked. They lost because theirs didn't. It's that simple and that terrible." The jungle kept its secrets for decades. Wrecked equipment rusting into soil, bones scattered where men fell, unexploded ordnance waiting in the undergrowth. Henderson Field expanded into an international airport, built over the ground where thousands died. And somewhere in archives and forgotten documents, the captured diaries and letters remained. Evidence of the moment when one form of warfare met another, and learned which would dominate the modern age. Not through glory or heroism, through weight of metal and efficiency of systems. The iron arithmetic of industrial war.